So uh, a uh, about 5 years ago, um, actually more than 10 years ago, part of a project out of the Academy of Marxism in Beijing was what was unfolding in the United States, and agreement that there was a general rebellion of the social base of the U.S. ruling class, which are weaker business owners, which range in wealth from multi-billionaires like the Waltons and the Koch brothers, who are not part of the ruling class, uh, meaning those with the hold over the state apparatus. Um, uh, um, but the overwhelming majority are actually quite poor business owners whose standard of living has been falling, and who work for usually often 7 days a week, are unable to take vacations, have no health insurance or very costly health insurance, and so on. But in any event, the point was the general rebellion of the social base. That's the first general rebellion in the entire history of the United States. There were many localized rebellions. In any event, I asked John Womack, who is quite knowledgeable in U.S. history. One, could he confirm this is the first general rebellion? And he said yes. And I said, how come there hasn't previously been a general rebellion? And the next time we met, he came quite prepared and singled out two reasons. One, that why there had not been a general rebellion, and one was the plentifulness of land. Hence, Steve pointing out housing prices aren't the same as they used to be. Something's happened. And of course, there's the cost of land has exploded. And the second reason he gave surprised me, which was the United States has the loosest bankruptcy regulations in the entire world. And that's why there hadn't been a general rebellion. Then I pointed out, well, actually, and he said, the cheap land is over. And then I added, well, actually, in 2006, after trying for many years, the banks, the owners of the banks, the real ruling class changed bankruptcy laws and made them much, much more difficult and humiliating to go into bankruptcy. And that affected, above all, small business owners. And so the very next year, so this is 2006, in 2007, we have the bursting of a housing bubble, and 2008 financial crisis hits the imperial center, and millions of small business owners lost their homes in the next 4 or 5 years. And the cost now of housing has gone off the roof. And I think several of us on this Zoom event have are experiencing at least a threat to our housing. That's certainly true for us, but not just us. And in any event, we really want to welcome Steve Revilak, who's been a good friend of the Center for Marxist Education for, 6, 7 years now, and made quite a presentation on housing 3 or 4 years ago, and we've wanted the repeat and expansion of it, and we're so happy to have Steve, who's a member of a town meeting, is that it, in Arlington, and and even though officially he really is a musician, somehow he is also a scientist of housing and much more, and a bicyclist. So, so Steve, unmute yourself, and so happy to have you. And let's take it from there.
All right, thank you, Wadi. Zach, could you make me a co-host so that I may share, do some screen sharing? I have slides.
Yes, let me see. I always forget how to do this, but I'm
So click
pretty
participants, and then
Okay.
find my name, and then right click, and there should be an option to make host or make co-host.
Okay. You should be the host now.
Okay, so here we go. So in theory, you should be seeing the title slide now.
Can.
Okay, good. So hello, everyone. My name is Steve, and I want to thank you for inviting me. As Wadi said, I am a town meeting member in Arlington, Massachusetts. Town meeting is, we have a town form of government, and town meeting is a legislative body in the town. I am also a member of the of Arlington's redevelopment board, which is our local planning authority. I've served on the zoning board of appeals, and have, it started off as I got interested in housing and urban planning and transportation, and just sort of pursued some opportunities to get involved with that on a local level. But yeah, I'm here to talk about, yes, we do have a housing crisis in the greater Boston area, and in many other parts of the country, frankly. And part of this is demographics, but a large part of it is just policies that we've adopted and followed over the last couple of decades. So how did I get involved in all this stuff? Well, a few years ago, my wife and I bought a house, and we, at one point in time, were thought about adding an addition. And though we ended up not doing this, one of the things I discovered was, gosh, there's a lot of red tape involved if you want to build something. And even if that something is just an addition on a house. And, walked away from that experience thinking, well, gosh, there's got to be an easier way to do this. So it was just sort of like the string that I pulled on and pulled on and pulled on, and and now it's sort of, I guess you could say it's become sort of a passion for mine, and also a municipal pastime. So a lot of the policies around housing that we have today, originated in the 20th century. They did not exist in the year 1900. So things that I think are relevant are the introduction of zoning, and we'll talk about what that is later. The government subsidization of home ownership, the emergence of housing as a form of capital, housing policy as a tool for segregation, and also, the rise in popularity of the automobile in suburbs. And a lot of the things that, probably seemed like genuinely good ideas at the time, just have contributed to, slow rolling us into a housing shortage and other calamities. And we'll talk about that later. So zoning is a very dry technical subject, but it basically has to deal with, it's a general term for land use regulations. So it regulates things like building size. So, you can have 2 stories, or you can have 4 stories. You can build right up to the front lot line, or you have to be set back so many feet from the the front line and so many feet from the sides, just, physical dimensional things. The other thing that zoning regulates is uses. So on this, particular area, you can build single family homes, you can build apartments, you can build a supermarket, or, other uses that either are allowed or are not allowed. And the beginnings of this started in the a little over 100 years ago. So, in terms of law, zoning is actually something fairly new, at least compared to like say English common law. But, the ideas were to separate, residential uses and industrial uses. You don't necessarily want a steel mill or a slaughterhouse right in the middle of a residential neighborhood. And the other notable motivation were step backs on skyscrapers. So this originated in New York City, who adopted one of the first zoning laws in the United States in 1916. They were concerned about access to light and fresh air. And a lot of this had to do with public health at the time, because people observed that, in areas where there's not a lot of light, there's not a lot of ventilation, people tend to get sick. And, at that point in time, we did not know what virology was. But, people could see a correlation in, where with New York and the buildings in particular there, they added rules so that, as you go up, you have to kind of step back from the street, and you go up a little more and you step back a little more. But this is to provide some access to sunlight to, people basically on the streets. Now, the United States being the United States, one of the first things that, very early on in the process, it did not take long for people to get the idea is if you can regulate land use in a given area, could we say that these areas are for Black people and these areas are for white people? So we did that, or at least we tried. So there was racially based zoning districts early on. This was challenged in the courts and declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1917. The case is Buchanan versus Worley. But basically, there was a white homeowner in Louisville, Kentucky, that wanted to sell their home to a Black family. And the town's law basically said, no, you cannot do that because your home is in a zone that is where only whites are allowed. So the Supreme Court, the white homeowner challenged this, and the Supreme Court ultimately sided with them. And the rationale was that they determined racially based zoning to be a violation of the 14th Amendment to rights to life, liberty, and property. So the idea of property rights means that you can use it and you can enjoy it, and part of that enjoyment involves being able to sell to whom you choose. So the reason for this ruling and why it was a violation, because the Louisville's racial zoning impinged upon the white property owner's right to sell property to a Black family. So if you can't zone by race, can you zone by economic status? Yeah, and the answer is yes. So there are, even under modern fair housing laws that protect things like minority groups, families with children, veteran status. Class is not a protected, economic class is not a protected class under any of our fair housing laws. And after the Supreme Court struck down the idea of racially based zoning, one of the things that the federal government started doing was to promote the idea of zoning, and single family zoning in particular, to communities. So if you think now you can't draw a line, now that you can no longer draw a line on a map and say this side is Black and this side is white, you can draw a line that says this area will have single family homes and this area will have apartments. So who ends up having the money to afford the single family homes versus who can only afford the apartments. It's one example of the way that we tend to use class and wealth as a proxy for race, where we can't use race explicitly. So communities, under the urging of the Commerce Department, started to adopt single family zoning. This was also challenged legally and upheld by the Supreme Court in a case called Amber versus Euclid. And one of the things that the court observed in its decision was it opined that apartment houses were a nuisance to single family homes, and so that it was fair to regulate them that way. And after World War II, this becomes sort of the predominant land use, particularly in suburbs. Single, even around eastern Massachusetts, there is a very large portion of land where the only thing that you can build is a single family house. So some of the other policies that have kind of played a role in this, a big one is the Homeowners Loan Corporation of America. So what started out off as sort of relief for families in the Great Depression was the federal government's subsidization of home mortgage loans, and the terms under which those loans are given. So back in the day, if you wanted to buy a house, you would the bank, you would approach a bank, and the bank might lend you the money, and they typically have like a 5-year repayment period. So what the federal government did was they encouraged lending to happen on different terms. So like the 30, 20 or 30-year fixed rate mortgage, that was a creation of our federal government to encourage home ownership. And they also were willing to underwrite their loans, which means that it basically takes the risk. They assume the risks rather than the banks doing this. So getting into the actuarial business, they needed some actuarial maps. And what they did was to go around and just sort of, make, basically take a map and designate different areas depending on a set of characteristics. And, they note areas that they felt were good risks versus ones that they felt were bad risks. So there were 4 grades to these. Green was the best, and these were areas that were generally white, affluent professionals. So you had like lawyers and doctors and, just upper class people. Blue was, still desirable. Yellow were denoted areas that they considered declining. And if you read some of the paperwork behind the recommendations for how different areas got designated, yellow areas tend to have remarks like the area has a large concentration of foreigners, of Jews, of relief families. So this yellow meant, a lower class area. And finally, we had red areas. These were called hazardous, and they happen to be areas with the presence of heavy industry or the presence of a large Black population. So hence the term redlining. So these maps were used as the basis for determining whether or not a loan for a specific property would be eligible for underwriting. And if properties in red areas were not eligible for these mortgage loans, which were really the most favorable terms that you could get. This is an example of one of these maps. It is Cambridge, Massachusetts, and you can hopefully you can see my mouse, but here's the Mass Ave Bridge. This is Mass Ave. Surprisingly, Cambridgeport was a red area. I'm not quite sure why. I'm guessing this has to do with Cambridge's older industrial past. But if you get over to areas like West Cambridge, Belmont, Arlington, they're more favorable in terms of the risk models. This area of, you can see the different redlined areas in here in Cambridge. The areas that are not rated, you've got Harvard University, you've got area around MIT and what used to be Cambridge's sort of old industrial districts. They weren't rated just because folks assume that, no one's ever gonna, people aren't gonna ask for home loans there. So these maps, although they were drafted in the 1930s, they have still their effect has been really long lasting. So even and you could see you could look at maps then and find certain tendencies of things to happen even today. So for example, racial segregation is one of them. A lack of investment is another. The areas that that the HOLC thought were more favorable were more likely to have investment in terms of homes, in terms of businesses, in terms of good infrastructure. Um, the yellow and red areas today are more likely to have heat islands, simply because there are fewer trees and more pavement. Um, there's also been a tendency for apartment buildings and public housing, especially, to be located in the yellow zones. And the one of the I think most surprising example of how this you can still see the effects of this today is Detroit's Burwood Wall. So the Burwood Wall covers a neighborhood, or surrounds a neighborhood in Detroit called 8 Mile, and you know somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, a property developer wanted to build homes and sell them under basically the FHA's, the Federal Housing Administration's, mortgage terms. And when they, talked to um, the federal government at the time said, well, this area is next to a number of Black neighborhoods. So we're concerned that it's, it would be a financial risk to build homes there. Long story short, the way the developer was able to become eligible, or have the area become eligible for FHA financing, was to build a 6-foot concrete wall around that section of the city. And the wall is still there today. It is a landmark. But it just sort of goes to reinforce how the role that segregation played in, the way these policies were enacted and implemented. So to just sort of like put a bit of a summary on this part of my presentation, 20th century housing policy was really a system that promoted segregation at multiple layers. This includes the ability to get a loan that's sort of at the federal level. It also includes what individual communities did, because they're the ones who are actually passing drawing the maps and deciding what can be built where. There was an orientation towards race-based segregation, and over time, my opinion personally, it's gradually shifted to more of a class-based segregation. Yeah, we can debate the extent to which class is a proxy for race, but there is definitely an element to class-based segregation now. If your income is a certain amount of money, you don't necessarily buy a home in Lexington or Winchester. Maybe you end up, or actually even Cambridge for that for that matter. There is a notion out there of drive till you qualify, and this has to deal with the kind of the trend where people's preferences for living have shifted, and you kind of have to go further and further out from a city center to find something that's within your price range. So zoning has been an effective form of segregation, and in particular the rules that encourage a lot of low densities housing, single and two family homes. They've worked to limit the number of homes available, and this is one of the factors that contributes to our housing shortage today. So a couple of other sides that I think are worth exploring is that I'd like to go into, and one of them is the role of housing as a form of capital. So once upon a, back in the early 20th century, not a whole lot of people owned their own homes. People tended to rent, or renting was quite prominent. Then came the Russian Revolution of 1917, and the powers that be in the United States were a little bit rattled by this because capitalism, industrial capitalism in the early 20th century was no bowl of fun and games, and they were concerned that something like that might happen here. So the sort of big idea was, well, we don't want a workers' revolt. The capitalists want to maintain capitalism. So what we'll do is we'll encourage people to take part in the system, own your own home. And the idea is that if you give people their own house, they have something to show for themselves, they're invested in the system, then they're likely to, then they're less likely to challenge it. So this started off as a political campaign. It was just, buttons and signs and slogans, and there wasn't really a lot of policy or funding behind it. But the, policies that came afterwards were very much oriented towards, encouraging home ownership. And you think about it, this is brilliant. The landed gentry is not going to rise up and overthrow itself. And this is actually one of the tough things, that makes this a tough nut to crack. And I'll go into that a little bit more, but, the fact of when you do own a piece of property in a neighborhood, and maybe you bought into it because you like the neighborhood, there is generally, concern or resistance to change. And where this becomes difficult is, our problem is that we don't have enough housing. Adding more housing would change the neighborhoods, and there's that whole resistance to change part. Anyway, I'll get to that a little more later. But yeah, one of the things that home ownership is also encouraged is housing has become a type of equity and a way to build generational wealth. So today, if you buy a home, or if you bought a home years ago, it's worth more today. You could sell it, you could pass it off to your children, or whatever. But it's something that either it's a way for you to build wealth, or a way for you to pass wealth down to the next generation. We're seeing commercial investment in housing, and this has become, I think, a little more true in the last few years as prices have gone up, or what they say, the assets have appreciated. Investors will go where the money is, and right now there is serious money in real estate. And part of this is the demand to supply issue. The production of housing is incredibly regulated on a whole bunch of different levels, but the amount of money you can sell a home for, completely unregulated. Rent, also unregulated. In fact, Massachusetts has a law called the Massachusetts Rent Control Prohibition Act. This was passed by ballot measure in the mid-90s, but basically our state law prohibits any municipality from enacting any form of rent control. There is an exception. You can enact rent control, but the municipality has to pay the landlord the difference. So, it is very much, by statute, we very much encourage, real estate as a commodity. And, there's, it's kind of like, if you're a company that makes a thing, having the laws tamp down competition is a benefit to you. And we've done the same sort of thing with respect to like housing production. So just to put some numbers behind this, one of my hobbies is every week I still get a paper copy of our town's weekly paper. And in the back, there's a section that lists all of the property real estate transactions that have occurred. And so I typically go through these, pick out half a dozen to just, capture the spread of prices and stick them in a spreadsheet. But one of the things I look at is, okay, this place sold for, say, $725,000. Well, when did it last sell? And the, for us, our assessor's information, keeps track. You could also find it in the in your county's land registry of deeds. But so, I would look at, okay, the house sold for this much. The previous sale was in 1972, and back in 1972, the person who bought the house bought it for $33,000. Well, $33,000 to $725,000 is a huge amount of capital appreciation. But to be fair, there's been inflation. So what do you, if we take $33,000 in 1972 and we adjust it, to say $23, and all of these sales are in 2021 or 2022 and 2023. They're, I think, all single family homes. There might be a two family or two in here, but so that home you bought for $33,000 in 1972 would have cost in today's dollars about $238,000. But again, you sold it for $725,000, so roughly 3 times the amount. And I sorted this table by year, so you could just sort of see that in the last 2 years, you're looking at 800, 900,000, $1 million plus to buy a home. If you look at the sales back in the 70s, well, it was the equivalent to like $200,000 or $300,000. In the 80s, roughly 3 to 5, and in the 90s, it's maybe 4 to 6. But housing costs more than it used to, and it's also been a very lucrative investment. And this is sort of an area where I've found that people can be a little touchy, and especially when you have, say, someone wants to build an apartment building, or they're proposing an apartment building, and people turn out and say, no, there will be traffic, there will be strangers, this will ruin our quality of life. And you look at public meetings, hey, people have to give their name and address. It's a Massachusetts thing, but you're making a comment in a public meeting, you identify yourself. You look up, you listen to the sometimes you'll have a person making one of these comments, and you'll go look up their address and see, yeah, they own the house, and wow, it's $1 million house. And gosh, you paid $99 for it. And by definition, a millionaire is someone who has $1 million worth of assets. And you point out the fact that, well, why are you, the millionaire, opposing this apartment building? And you often get a response of, well, I'm not a millionaire. I wouldn't be able to afford this house if it weren't for my parents. And this is kind of the problem. Anyway, I digress. So we'll also talk about transportation, because one of the things I did not fully appreciate the last time I gave this talk is the extent to which housing and transportation are two sides of the same coin. So back in post-war, starting with, I'd say post-war, post-World War II America, there was sort of a re-envisioning of the American dream. So, and the thing that you were supposed to aspire to was to own a house in the suburbs. It'd have a yard, it'd have a picket fence, you'd have 2 cars in the driveway, and that was the definition of a good life. And we built those. One of the things that we tended to do in building out suburbs was the adoption of monolithic zoning districts. So if you go to a place like Central Square, you've got businesses on Mass Ave, you got a few businesses on side streets, you've got houses, triple deckers, apartments, just kind of mixed in together. And back in the day, if you might live next to a row of stores, and if you wanted to go grocery shopping, you just walk down the street and walk back. So with the suburbs, we adopted some different design ideas. So you put houses here, you put offices here, you put shopping over there. Maybe there's a few apartments spread over there someplace, but things are really spread out. And there is, this was done with the idea that, everyone will have a car and the car will make it possible for people to, go from one place to another. And, you won't, it'll free us from, the need to walk or take public transportation. So this little quote comes from, it's not exactly a verbatim quote, gliding along to your destination on ribbons of concrete and steel in the modern miracle of transportation, the American automobile. This was inspired by sort of a video that was produced by General Motors in the 1950s to encourage people to write their legislators and talk to their city officials. And basically they were asking people to support the development of highways and the interstate systems, and more facilities for drivers and automobiles to avoid traffic jams. So, along with the suburbs, you have the establishment of the U.S. interstate system. The whole idea is that, the car was going to free us from the city. And, all we need is highways for us to get around quickly so you could work in the city and then just drive to your home in the suburbs and, drive back in again the next morning. Now, of course, the U.S. interstate system is also associated with urban renewal efforts. So if you need to build a highway in the city, well, maybe there's a neighborhood there already. And in most cases there was. And what a lot of the interstates that we built during that time, typically involved taking land by eminent domain. They tended to be poorer minority neighborhoods, and we just leveled them. There is someone, I've heard the saying, urban renewal is Negro removal. I don't think that's wrong. But, this was kind of seen as a fringe benefit, is that not only can you get this great brand new highway, we can also clear out this poor neighborhood. So, basically we invented sprawl. There's no other way to put it. You just basically, 20th century or post World War II urban planning just kind of involved three things. You clear land, you build roads, and you burn gas. And while this might have been seen as liberating at the time, I don't know if the long-term consequences have necessarily served us well. So consequences of car-first traffic of urban planning is, well, there's traffic noise and pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And if you go to a zoning board hearing where someone's trying to build an apartment, you're likely to hear lots of people talk about traffic and parking. Steve's first axiom is that everyone likes driving, but nobody likes traffic. And, this is kind of, this has been my observation again and again and again. One of the things that, we've done to cities is, we've kind of adopted them for cars. So where you might have had a neighborhood of shops, you have wide roads, you have lots of places, you have lots of parking space. Because, if you have a vehicle and you need to go two places, you need a number of parking spaces that's some multiple of the number of vehicles you have. So we've got huge amounts of pavement and, sort of principles that, we started designing cities for cars rather than for people who, for cars and for people who commute from suburbs rather than for people who actually live in the cities. There's been less emphasis on, what are more cost-effective and sustainable, efficient means of transportation, like walking and biking and public transit. There was even a certain degree of collusion during 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, somewhere in there, of automobile manufacturers that, work to encourage local governments to, like, get rid of your public transit systems. These are obsolete. People want to get around in cars, and if you, to the extent that you do need them, well, we can give you buses, and those are perfectly fine. This has led to the automobile tax. So cars, they're not free. In addition to paying the price of the car, you also have to pay for, you need to pay for gas, you need to pay for maintenance, you need to pay for insurance. And, part of this is, so more in a lot of places, this is something you have to do simply because other transit options just aren't that viable. Traffic is also a major source of fatalities in the United States. So in 2021, we had close to 43,000 transportation fatalities. It's it's right up there with gun deaths. That said, it is a large improvement in the number of, we're actually doing a lot better than we did in the like 50s and 60s and 70s, as if you compare like number of deaths to the number of vehicle miles traveled. Cars have gotten safer for the occupants inside them, though probably less safer for what are around them. Yeah, another thing that we've sort of discovered, I talked about, like, other forms of transportation being more, carbon efficient or less polluting. So this is a map produced by a group at the University of California, Berkeley. And basically you pulled together a number of census or a number of data sources and tried to map out on a zip code by zip code basis, based on what we know about the economics of who's in the zip code. What's the carbon footprint? And when they, when you put it on a map, a couple of things that you sort of notice, and they call it out here. So New York City, this green area. So green is basically a low number of tons of CO2 equivalent emitted per year. Red is a high number. The big urban centers like New York, green, surrounded by a bunch of red. Philadelphia, green, surrounded by a bunch of red. DC, green, surrounded by a bunch of red. What they've sort of found is that, people living in urban areas, the carbon emissions per household are a lot lower than people living in suburbs. And, the transit is part of that. And, more generally, there's sort of, it's sort of a lifestyle kind of thing. People who live in the suburbs tend to be more affluent and they consume more, and that also increases their carbon footprint. The sort of like subtext of this is that global warming is a lifestyle problem. And, although a lot of some of the plans being put forward to address this, and there are, a whole lot of considerations to make, but, so far a certain number of them have focused on, like, well, okay, we've got to switch to electric vehicles. Yes, this is a great idea. An electric vehicle will, even if you're, not using a like wind or solar to charge it, you're using, say, it's getting charged by electricity produced by a natural gas power plant. It's going to emit way less carbon than just, your typical internal combustion engine by a factor of like 4 or so. If you compare today's vehicles with the ones from, say, the early 70s, where the typical car had a V8 engine with about a 400cc displacement, a carburetor, it burned leaded gas, it got 10 miles to the gallon. So the electric vehicles are, an incremental improvement, kind of, a little bit more of so than the improvement we made from vehicles in the 1970s, but it's still just an incremental improvement. Single occupancy vehicles, for better or worse, are the most space and energy inefficient way to get around, but people like them, and this will, and people like them, and we um, tend to we still encourage people to like them. So anyway, I'll stop digressing. So tying this back to this stuff back to the housing shortage, I'll start with a little bit on the regional level. So we've talked about zoning and how it's been a tool for limiting the amount of housing in an area, particularly in the suburbs surrounding cities. This has led to relatively fixed supply and not much new construction. In fact, if you compare the number of building permits issued in Massachusetts during the last 30 years versus the 30 years prior to that, we've basically been cut our housing production by around half, maybe a little more, while the population of the area has been growing. So there's demand for housing. Cities emptied out during the suburbanization period. We call this white flight. Now people are, realizing that, hey, cities are actually do have a lot to offer, and being stuck in traffic all the time maybe kind of sucks. So we now have, this pattern is totally reversed as sort of a play on words. I'm calling it white return flight, but it's a thing. Between 2020 or 2010 and 2018, Boston and the immediate suburbs, which constitute a group called the Metro Mayors Coalition, or MMC communities. So right around Boston, we've added 148,000 new jobs. We've added 110,000 residents. We've only built 32,500 new homes. So this is, kind of where the crunch. There's more demand for housing than there is housing to go around. And, with sort of the free market way that we have for real estate, we have high prices. They're high, but they're right in a sense, because the buyer and seller agree. If you wanted to sell your house for $10 million, maybe you can't get that. But, if you sell it for $1 million, it's because two parties happen to agree on that. And one of, I think, our big challenges is to make it possible to shift that point of agreement to something lower than it is today. On the more macro level, sort of like the big picture issues, yes, we have a housing shortage, and we sort of adopted a lifestyle preference for suburbanization and sprawl. We adopted a lot of policy preferences for travel by private automobile. And in some areas, travel by anything but car is downright hostile. We've also built out around cities. So we're housing and transportation are two sides of the same coin. If you think of, you have to go to work or you need to go places on a regular basis. So, there's sort of like a sphere of things you can get to on foot, and a sphere of things that you could get to maybe by bicycle. And there's a bigger sphere of things that you can get to by automobiles. So our metro areas have basically become the sphere of things that you can get to by automobile. And, they're about as large as they can comfortably be at this point, or at least in my opinion. And the way we've kind of used that available area has been kind of relatively inefficient, which, basically means we're going to have to do two things. We're either going to have to make a bigger sphere and people will spend more time commuting, or we'll have to kind of start to fill in and be more efficient in how, we've used our land. So what should we do about this? So points to consider. Yeah, yes, we need more housing. There is no two ways around that. It's necessary. It is not sufficient by itself. During the 20th century, our policies created groups that were advantaged and groups that were disadvantaged. And in my opinion, you know, this distinction is something that deserves recognition and probably, well, definitely different sets of policies or different solutions. In fact, there's not one solution to the housing problem. It is, there's a lot of moving pieces involved because it's not just housing. It is also transportation. It is also infrastructure. It's also access to jobs, et cetera. Where we build matters. The sort of one of the things I've become sort of fond of is the idea of smart growth. Smart growth is, yeah, it sounds like a buzzword, but the idea is that in some areas of the country, the population is growing, and you can try to be strategic and efficient in how you handle that compared to, say, the 20th century, where I think our policies were not so smart growth. Traffic being our status quo, this will not go away by itself. Yes, people love their cars, but there have to be other options available, and they have to be convenient and reliable. Convenient and reliable is something we're not really delivering on currently, at least not in the Boston area, and it's something we'll have to work on. And again, housing is a warm-up exercise for addressing climate change. And, housing policy and transportation policy, they are also climate policy. So this is, these things don't exist in isolation. Yes, so yes, we need more homes of all different varieties at price points for different stages in people's lives. Yeah, because the room in an apartment I rented in my 20s is different than, the home I have today, which will probably be different than the home I have in my more senior years, where I will be completely done with the idea of shoveling snow and having to do yard work. So a couple of things. This is now I realize after doing these slides that these are kind of Massachusetts, or at least partially Massachusetts specific, because I live in Massachusetts and I sort of follow what's going on here, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. And different parts of the country are doing different things. But one of the things that Massachusetts passed, laws, was something called housing choice. And the idea, this was, predominantly created by the Baker administration, and the Healy administration seems to be pretty much on board with this. But the idea is that there is a shortage of housing in Massachusetts. Prices are rising, people are getting priced out, and we need to do something to encourage more homes. So part of this is something called MBTA community, called multifamily requirements for MBTA communities. So if you are one of the cities or towns that are served by the T, or you're next to a city or town that's served by the T, you are an MBTA community. And under state law, you now have to provide a district, an area of your town where multifamily housing, basically 3 homes or more, is permitted by right without having to go through a special permit process and possibly being taken to court over your attempts to build a house. So the idea is to make it legislatively easier to build more homes. Now the size of these districts and the capacity, how many homes they can contain, it's very much community specific. There's a state agency that's been trying to work this out over the last year, and they finally have a plan. And but it's fairly tailored to what the communities are capable of doing. We've also reduced the voting threshold for bylaw and ordinance changes that would allow more housing. So in Massachusetts, traditionally, if you wanted to change a zoning law, you needed a 2/3 vote of a legislature, of your legislature, which could be a city council, it could be a town meeting. Now, if for changes that allow multifamily housing, it's now a simple majority. So where, it's in theory, the idea is that it will make things easier to pass. So the smart growth, I mentioned this earlier, but the general idea is to, rather than doing greenfield development, where you have to build in addition to building buildings, you have to build roads and all of the infrastructure, the water, the sewer, the electric lines, et cetera. You kind of find places where, that infrastructure already exists and you can leverage what's there. And, part of this is, it also involves providing transit choices and mixing up uses. So, like, for example, if you shouldn't have, instead of driving to the other side of town to go to grocery shopping, well, maybe you can go downstairs or you can walk a block over. So it's it's what we call infill development. You're taking places that are already developed and you're just, kind of filling them in a little more. Smart growth actually started with the main proponent of this seems to be the US EPA. I'm not sure they originated it, but they definitely seem to be supportive of the idea. And to close, these are a couple of resources. So, that deal with different aspects of the things I've talked about, and I will do my best to get the slides to Jeanette, and hopefully they can be posted someplace or distributed. But in the interim, I will stop sharing and hand the host duties back to Zach, and I'm sure you all got something to say to me, so you should feel free to go for it.
Wow, Steve, thank you so much, and a very comprehensive presentation and development from your presentation about 4 years ago, it was. So thrilled about that, and I want to give a special welcome to an old friend of the CME who's joining us first time in quite a while. That's Valley Buland, who was present when the CME was founded almost 50 years ago, and who headed the Rent Control Board in Cambridge, I believe. She can add to that, and we look forward to her comments. For now, just wanted to point out that essentially, without the working class leading the expropriation of the landlords and finance capital behind them, there's going to be the big landlords, not small, but also ending any speculation in lands. But without the working class moving on that question of land ownership and speculation, there's going to be no solution to national questions. And in Boston, would like to point out that a 2015 study by the Federal Reserve Bank found a 30,000 to 1 inequality in wealth between white households and US Black households. In other words, descendants of people who'd been enslaved in the United States. 30,000 to 1. The average wealth of the median wealth of a Black household in Boston was $8 in 2015, and almost certainly has declined since then. And that has a lot to do with the housing policies and the redlining that you described. And Valley may touch on that. But also, without touching on this, without the working class taking the initiative on this land question, there's going to be no solution to the existential threat from environmental crisis that's facing humanity. And there's going to be no solution to the housing crisis that we face in every campus country, and that is hitting youth especially hard, either forced to live with their parents into their 40s or forced to live with 5 or 6 roommates, or to face homelessness. So this is really crucial. In any event, let me maybe open by asking Valley if she would like to open with comments, and we can take it from there. But really, thanks, Steve. So appreciate this, and can't wait till the next time. So.
Hi, Wadia, and everyone. It's nice to be here. And thank you for mentioning me. I certainly was not prepared to talk today, but thank you. It's been very interesting to listen. And one thought maybe for the future would be to, I thought the presentation was very interesting, and thank you to Steve. One thought for the future might be to talk about the effects of rent control on that whole zoning analysis, Steve, that you presented. As you know, of course, it was very controversial. People, both sides, one side feeling that it really stabilized housing in the cities that had rent control, and stabilized rents and made it more possible for low-income people to stay in those cities. And the other side said, it ruined the housing stock, et cetera, et cetera. So just, just a thought for the future to talk about the effects of rent control and how that plays into the sort of zoning analysis that you gave. But anyway, thank you. It's nice to be here, and a lot of food for thought.
And I see Tilly has her hand up, and also was present when the CME opened, I guess it's 48 years ago to be exact. So.
Okay, I have a couple of comments. I feel the title was misused because it was really, to me, suburban housing, okay? Not city housing, all right? And being a Boston resident, over 60 years, and seeing what's going on. One thing you did leave out, and this is whether you call it suburban but housing, was government policy was World War II was the bonus given to vets that gave them that, and seriously, whatever else, you need to include that as a very specific piece, how it affected Black and white, but certainly that whole piece of how our housing stuff was, developed. The other thing is, when you talk about components, I forget, there was one slide, but you had like 7 components of planning. I did not see the land planning. I did not see parks. And I grew up in planning. Actually, that was, my father was a landscape architect and worked on the Garden State in New Jersey, no less, but that's a very important piece to me of any planning, be it urban or city, suburban or urban, either that. And by the way, in terms of my own viewpoint, yes, I live in the heart of the city. However, my daughter is extremely involved in housing in Attleboro, Mass, which is a small city, you know, and familiar with housing stuff going on there. And believe it or not, also my summer rent, I rent in Sandwich, and very familiar with what's going on there, and you know how how they're dealing with housing. So I'm not coming from just a Boston viewpoint, and we'll leave the other sun out in Watertown, okay? But the question of rent control is a prime one, and that's a major, well, I'll call it political fight that's going on today in the city. All right, and the way the housing stuff, I'll leave another little piece that you left out of your housing legislation, which is involved, you know, not with single family, but with rental. When we before we bought our first house, so this was it, we bought our house, it was in 1958. Before we were trying to rent, okay? So leaving us, the fact is my husband was Cape Verdean, so it was a whole color question. And, you know, stuff was very blatant, extremely blatant. And technically there was a law, and, you know, you referred to some legislation about illegally, you could not discriminate. Well, yes, one of the pieces is that if you had a mortgage through federal homeowners, but well, I'm talking large homeowners. So we went looking for an apartment and money was not the question, because my husband's brother was paying me full-time job, taking care of his kids in home. So it was a question of wasn't the money, but finding the place. Found an absolutely wonderful apartment, 4 bedrooms, and you know, good heating, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then came the color question, and everything was set until he met my husband. Then came the question, could we sue? This was 1958. And yeah, we wanted to, but we couldn't spend the time doing that. We had to get a place to live. So we ended up buying actually buying, my parents gave us a belated wedding present. We had no wedding presents from them. And bought a rundown place in Dorchester. And who provided the mortgage for that? All right, South Boston Savings Bank. What was South Boston Savings Bank? That was Day, Louise Day Hicks. It was owned by the Day family. Do I need to say more? Okay. You know, and so that instead of the you know, if it was a quote white family, you would be spending a down payment of 10%. Okay, we had to come up with the 20%, which my present from our parents did not quite cover, but we somehow managed. And the only way we managed is because we had a progressive friend who fought through the whole McCarthy period, but who was our real estate lawyer. And, you know, we're able to pull stuff off. But
thanks, yeah,
it's the genie in the closet is race. Mm-hmm. And absolutely, you know, how do you say, you know, can't tell you, you know, how do you say, we were looking for a house in the suburbs, and we would have the appointment and would drive up, and then nope, weren't met. Or if we would meet, we never saw the person again.
Okay, yes.
And it wasn't a question of money, it was race.
Oh, absolutely.
And actually,
Bonnie,
yeah.
if I can just sort of circle back on a couple of things. Yes, I acknowledge that I did not talk about parks, and I agree that they are, you know, a very important part of, you know, cities. Boston spent quite a few years trying to get to the point where every resident could be within a 15-minute walk of a park. They finally did. The one thing that I think is sort of interesting with, you know, if in cities you tend to have public open spaces, suburbia has sort of focused on private open spaces. So instead of, you know, instead of having your, you know, local park, you have your private backyard, which I think that's been kind of detrimental. Parks, you know, it basically means that access to green space is, you know, again, it's another commodification, you know, where the park provides this for free, but the backyard costs $2 million an acre. With respect
also,
to
right now, you have the thing where people environmentally are doing their own little vegetable park growing, you know, of Attleboro, you know, particularly where my daughter runs the city thing. Oh, yeah, she's voluntarily running it. But in Boston too, I mean, all over the question, you know, how do you say, Victory Gardens grew from World War II, and we had them all over the Fenway here when we first moved to Boston. And now it's a question of reestablishing areas where you can grow your own. The spaces that when we first
let Steve finish, and
I'm
so
sorry,
Dean can
I should
speak,
shut up.
and any other participants who want to speak.
Yeah, so the one
Steve
other
wants
point,
to close, yeah.
so the one other point I wanted to make was, you know, the resistance to more housing just isn't limited to the suburbs. So for example, or two examples, in Dorchester, the Pine Street Inn has been trying to take what was an old, you know, former motel and use it for transitional housing. You know, it's basically housing for individuals who are homeless. And the amount of public pushback to this has been, you know, has been really impressive. There's been, you know, they don't want this homeless shelter in Dorchester. A similar thing has been happening, and this is also Dorchester, but the Shawmut Tea Station, someone has bought a lot, you know, basically right next to it. It used to be like some auto place or something along those lines, and they're trying to build an apartment building, and the neighbors keep fighting back. You know, they don't want the apartment building. Someone tries to build an apartment in Rossi. Well, the neighbors in Rossi don't want the apartment building. It's, you know, the whole hearing process for these, you know, like discretionary permits where there's public hearings involved. You know, the people who are notified are the ones next door, you know, immediately closest to it. They're property owners. You know, you don't necessarily get the renters notified. And, you know, the people have an aversion to change. So it's like, well, I don't know how I feel about, you know, seeing, you know, that lot next door turn into an apartment building, so I'm going to oppose it. You know, over the long term, these things end up working out just fine. So, you know, maybe you were concerned about the apartment, or maybe you really didn't like the apartment. the next 7 people who own your house are going to see the apartment there. They're going to be fine with it. And, this is something we don't take into account. And we also, the whole process is adversarial. And the one group that it leaves out the most are the people who would actually, or leave out, or the ones who would probably, I would argue, would be most affected by new housing, which is the people who actually live there.
Mm. I've had the privilege of spending time in China last 20 some years, and it's stunning there. What's happened in 20 some years is stunning in terms of development of housing. There are clusters of high-rise apartments, 20 to 30 stories high, spaced far enough apart and designed that people get sunshine. And there's community rooms, and there's mass transit hubs, usually a subway stop, and bus routes, and development of small businesses all around these clusters. And I have seen no slums in China. In India, you cannot move without seeing slums, steps from business districts, but not so in China. I've seen poor housing, especially in rural areas, but not slums, and no homeless people. It's extraordinary. And again, the mass transit, exceptional what they have built in these 22 years. In any event, a big, wonderful contribution of Steve's is this book, to me, The Color of Law. And in terms of how the government has segregated housing, and what the book misses, although it touches on the Russian Revolution, as did Steve, is what it really points, what they're doing is, what the government was doing was to divide workers. That's what's behind that house, that wall, 6-foot wall that Steve mentioned in Detroit. They're dividing auto workers in this case, because real unity between black and white workers had developed in the 1930s, in part responding to the Russian Revolution. And so in any case, I still appreciate Steve bringing to our attention the book, The Color of Law, and I'm about halfway through reading it. In any case, Gene, it's yours.
Well, thank you, Steve. That was excellent talk. And, this is a very topical question right now. I think PBS had a section on it last night in their program. So, yeah, it's very important. And I have a little bit different perspective as an old retired professor. I've been spared most of the worst excesses and humiliations of this capitalist system we live in. But I do try to keep my eyes open. And one thing that kind of shocked me just the other night, we have this homeless community. There are tent cities all over most urban areas, but there's one, they called themselves First They Came for the Homeless. It was so well organized. They had community contacts, and they had their own solar panels up and so forth. And I'd heard rumors, but I drove by the other day, and they've evicted the homeless people, which seems kind of surreal to me. How can they even do that? But, that's our current system.
Gene, you should indicate you're from Oakland.
Pardon?
Right? You live in Oakland.
I live in Oakland, right near
California.
Pardon?
California.
The enlightened state, yes.
Yeah.
So that's going on, and the other thing that's I've noticed is that here in the Bay Area, we have this problem that that there are more vacant housing than there are homeless people. So if you simply put the homeless people into available housing, that would solve the problem. And people have noticed that here in the Bay Area. Now, I haven't followed this as closely as I should, but they did pass, I think both the San Francisco and Oakland have passed resolutions saying that you put in a tax. If you have unoccupied housing, then that is rentable, then you will be taxed for that, because a lot of people just invested in the property and held it as a tax haven without, just taking it off the market. So that's been a problem. And the other observation that I just wanted to note, so I like your comments on that, but I just also just want to note that my understanding that in North Korea, every family owns their own home. It was a gift of Kim Il-sung after the United States just flattened the entire country. They had to rebuild, and that was just given to every family. So that's another socialist solution to this problem. But again, thank you so much for this very good, interesting discussion, and let's look forward to solutions.
Yeah, there's one could do a full hour talk on homelessness. Locally, I know that my community, Arlington is involved with Cambridge and Somerville in trying to what they call a continuum of care. You basically try to work with homeless populations, provide them with some services, and provide support when they decide. Not all of them. For some, it takes a while for them to decide that maybe they'd be better off living indoors. And one of the challenges is, I'm not surprised that there are more vacant apartments and homeless individuals, but one of the problems that we run into is you have someone, they want an apartment. The problem is, well, they don't have the money for the rent, and the rents in the area are higher than the programs that we have can subsidize in a lot of cases. It's not an easy problem.
I heard about another program that they just give people money. They decide problem of poor people is they don't have money. So one solution to poverty is simply give them money. So they have given people like $1,000 a month for 6 months to see if the people that they do give the money to, they get out of poverty on their own, either by starting businesses or other things, going back to school and so on. I don't know if you have comments on that. But thank you again.
Karen, I don't think we've heard from you yet.
Yes, hi, thank you, Steve, and appreciate this, very interesting. I didn't actually know how far back this all went. I thought we were talking about perhaps right around World War II, but you straightened me out on this. I wanted to bring up another country called Cuba, and the issue of the right to housing. And I know I'm speaking to kind of the choir here on the CME group and friends of the CME, but because of the blockade and because of the worldwide COVID problems and et cetera, the Cuban government is suffering and the Cuban people are suffering. And there is a little bit more unhoused people in Cuba now, especially in the larger cities. But there's a huge effort for the communities around to say, hey, come on in, spend the night on my couch, or here, come in. And it's also a tropical island. You don't have to worry about frostbite like we are here in Boston right now. And this has been a right for Cubans since 1959, 1960. That's a long time to have this experiment. And that's why we're fighting at the July 26 coalition to end the blockade. So there wouldn't be anyone who needed housing in Cuba, needed food, needed health care, etc. You just go and take a look at the World Health Organization's facts and figures about Cuba, and you go like, wow, they're doing really well. Compare that to Haiti or Costa Rica or some other countries. So I just end with that comment. Thank you.
Wow. Thanks, Karen. So happy to have you on. And Karen also pointed out that tomorrow, this was in chat, in Arlington, there's a demonstration in front of a town hall in support of Syed Faisal's family, who was killed by a Cambridge police officer just 10 days ago or so, 2 weeks ago, about this vacant housing. On any one night, there are 20 million. This is the most recent figures that I've looked at, but it's been a couple years since I've looked at it. But the 20 million vacant homes and apartments in the United States on any one night. One quarter of these, about 5 million, are vacant because they're second, third, fourth homes of the wealthy, and about 15 million are vacant year-round. And what a crime against humanity, considering the homelessness or effective homelessness that millions suffer in the United States, and that includes youth who are living with their parents or with roommates or on the street. But Yusuf?
Yeah, in New Haven, the green overlooks Yale campus, and unfortunately, because of this, police make frequent swoops and mistreat the homeless people spending the night or hang out in the green. I would also like to comment that my grandparents, both from Turkey, met in Baku, and when the Soviet rule came, it was by a decision of the vote by parliament. One of the first things the Bolsheviks did was consolidate housing, and actually it relates to a family story, incidentally. Okay, so thank you.
All right, Wadia, I notice that we're at time. So, you know, I assume there are some last words you would like to say, but you should unmute yourself first.
I just was inviting you as it's time to wrap up. If you wanted to close with a summary and the prep for your next presentation.
Oh, the summary is, wow, this is a bigger mess than I had realized even a few years ago. And, you know, this is one of those, I mean, I think this is one of these things where in order to solve problems like this, you either have to bring a lot of people on board, or, you know, you need kind of the, you know, higher levels of government. You bring people on board to change your to change what's going on in your community, or you need higher levels of government to kind of tell your community that, it's got some obligations to fulfill and it better fulfill them. California has, I think, is notable because over the last few years, they've had a worse housing shortage and much higher prices than Massachusetts. California is also probably started doing some things that, at the state level to really push municipalities to be less exclusionary. Like one of them is called housing elements. Every 8 years or so, cities and towns or cities in California have to submit a plan to, that shows, well, we think the population is going to grow by this much, and here's how we're going to accommodate provide the housing to support that level of population growth. And although they're required to do that, a lot of the plans have been sort of, half-arsed. But a new law with the new law that was passed, communities that are not in compliance, that haven't developed a workable housing plan, basically it opens up something called a builder's remedy. So the builder's remedy, as I understand it, is a builder can build whatever they want, regardless of what whatever kind of housing they want, regardless of what your local zoning says, as long as at least 20% of the units are affordable. So now you have, I guess, there are a couple of places in California where, where wealthier suburbs that have multi-acre properties that absolutely prohibit apartment buildings, or starting to get apartment buildings permitted. We'll see what happens. I guess that's the that's the last takeaway. Anyway, I want to thank you guys for having me again, inviting me back, and this was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And so to bring to your attention a book that Steve brought to my attention, The Color of Law, and essentially, again, how the state, the bodies of armed men that's controlled by the ruling class effectively and moved to divide black and white. And another book of importance, The Invention of the White Race, by Theodore Allen, a working class intellectual who just put together an extraordinary picture of invention of the white race, and specifically volume 2, extraordinary book. And this is in part to introduce our next series of Center for Marxist Education presentations, which will be chapter by chapter on state and revolution, and the extraordinary work starting with Marx and Engels, but really developed by Lenin on what is the state, that it's not a neutral body, but a historically developed instrument of the ruling class to enforce its interests, and hence things like the color of law. And so look for announcements, and thank you, everybody. And again, wonderful work, Steve. And goodbye, everyone, and see you in the next event. And Zach, thank you. And I think recording can
You're
end.
welcome.
Yeah.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.